This is the Firedog Podcast.
The views and opinions presented on today's episode are those of the speaker and do not necessarily represent the views of the Department of Defense or the United States Air Force.
Welcome, my name is Matt Wilson, and thank you for joining us for episode 24 of the Firedog Podcast. Our guests today are firefighters in the Air Force Reserves, firefighters for Indianapolis Fire Department in Indianapolis, Indiana, and instructors for the Air Force Reserve Firefighter Rescue and Survival Course held at Dobbins Air Reserve Base in Marietta, Georgia. Please welcome Travis Bender and Chris 𝗘𝗂𝗃𝗀. All right, welcome Travis, Chris. Great to have you guys on. Our good friend Whit Dotson, who we recorded with not too long ago, put me in contact with Chris, I think it was, told me that there was a Fireground survival rapid intervention course that the reserve put on up in Indiana. And so, we called you guys up and asked you to come on and talk about it because it sounds awesome. But before we get into too much of that, I'd like to hear a bit about each of you. So tell us where you're from, where you work, and how long you've been in the service.
Yeah, so I'm Chris 𝗘𝗂𝗃𝗀. I'm a reservist out of Grissom in Indiana. I'm going on 15 years in the reserve. Civilian side, I work for the Indianapolis Fire Department, where I'm on Engine 10 on the east side, if anybody's familiar. And I live here in Indy with my wife, 𝗘𝗃𝗀𝗃, and our newborn daughter, 𝗘𝗂𝗃.
Awesome. And great to meet you, Chris. Thanks for coming on, man. How about you, Travis?
Yeah, I'm Travis Bender, Master Sergeant, also out of Grissom, up northern Indiana, and been doing that I got in just shortly after Chris did, so we kind of came up through the ranks together a little bit. So just going on 14 years there. Civilian side, I also work for Indianapolis. I live south side Garfield Park area, if you're familiar with Indianapolis, with my new wife, Olivia. We just got married in May. So, and we got 2 crazy dogs, and that's about it for that.
Awesome, man. Congrats on the marriage. That's awesome. So working in Indianapolis, that's pretty cool. I know, you're probably going to see a heavier call volume than we will in the Air Force. So having that knowledge base to back up your instruction of the rapid intervention stuff and the Fireground survival, man, it sounds like we're in for some good content, man. I'm excited about it. So talk about the course a little bit. So first of all, and correct me if I'm wrong, Air Force Reserve component, Fireground survival rapid intervention course. I'm sure there's a specific name, like a formal name for it, but can you guys briefly explain what the course is, what the name is, and what it's about?
Yeah, so it's AFRC's Firefighter Rescue and Survival class. We call it FRAS for short. That's kind of the nickname we gave it. We actually hold it down in Georgia, Dobbins Air Reserve Base in Georgia. They have a huge training site. They put on a bunch of other classes as well. This is just one of the classes that they offer. We got in touch with them, and they were gracious enough to host us. It's 5 days long, roughly about 50 hours, Monday through Friday. We have a whole host of objectives we meet through each day. So it's kind of like a done when you're done kind of thing. Could go as long as, 10 hours. I mean, depending on how the students perform. So as the name implies, it's rapid intervention, a lot of, RIT operations, RIT tactics, and Fireground survival skills, self-survival, and then a lot of most of the drills are supplemented with large scenarios. So it's very intensive, physically demanding, mentally draining course. You're in gear, up to 10 hours a day. So really the only time we're in the classroom is the beginning. We talk about some of the stuff we're going to talk about today with you. And the rest of the week they're in gear, they're working. And, we have all the scenarios are deal in the realm of just the very nature of RIT operations or Fireground survival. All deals in high risk, low frequency events. So if you're familiar with the Johari's window of if you picture a window with 4 panes, one of those panes represents high risk, low frequency events. Those are your Mayday type, Fireground survival, the stuff hits the fan, right? And so that's the realm we operate in. every scenario the student runs into throughout the week meets Mayday criteria, and they have to solve all their problems. It's a very progressive course, which Chris could talk more about if you got anything to add, Chris.
Yeah, that was something that was really important to us developing the course, was to ensure that it's entirely progressive, right? Meaning that students learn everything they need to know early in the week that they'll need for later in the week. So they've got far less to manage Monday, Tuesday than they do Wednesday, Thursday. And we think that's really one of the only ways to start to tap into that fight or flight response that you would feel real world. That say you're, humping hose for 15 minutes and now you fall through a floor. Obviously we can't make students fear for their lives for real in training, but we can, give them, multiple decisions to make, right? And we can tax them physically, and we can give them more to manage, as the week progresses, hopefully to start to make the way that they would feel if that happened real world charted territory a little bit.
Yeah, it certainly makes sense. And we may get into this a little bit later, but what's the why? So I know down in Dobbins, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the reserves do, it's kind of maybe like a pre-deployment training site. Is that the idea of what they're doing down at Dobbins? And you guys called up and said, hey, we'd like to do this course, and they let you in down there. What was the motivator behind that?
Yeah, so we Chris and I had taken a few courses in RIT operations, that were modeled very similar to what we're doing here. And we were talking one day, really it was like kind of, over a beer, talking about some of the things we learned and where a lot of the really learning takes place, right, is recapping over a pint, right? And we started talking about, how do we bring some of that mentality? So we took a class called Smoke Diver in Georgia and Indiana, and then Fire Department Training Network on the south side of Indianapolis has great instructors, very knowledgeable, experienced old timers that have been doing this a long time, that taught us a ton. And we talked about how do we bring some of that mindset and that mentality in addition to the things we've been learning through, some of the books that we've been reading about survival and physiological and psychological responses to stress. How do we package that up and deliver it at the Air Force level, right? And we started implementing it at our home unit, started getting our troops spun up on it. And we just honestly had like kind of bigger aspirations for it. We're like, well, how can we expand this to further, to bring up Air Force firefighting to that, that realm or that level. And we started talking, and we have our chief, Aaron Daner, our deputy chief, Nick Ward. They're both really knowledgeable on obviously the Air Force side of things. And like Nick is an instructor for RIT Under Fire in Illinois for the Illinois Fire Service Institute. Chief Daner is he's a great, facilitator for that kind of thing, gave us the resources to do what we wanted to do. He suggested that we get in touch with the TCC guys down in Georgia. And yeah, they do a lot of pre-deployment training and stuff like that, but they have all the resources down there. So why not, get in touch with them and really try to, make it a reserve thing. And it just kind of grew from there. We thought we were going to get a bunch of, kickback on it. And, it's not a requirement, right? This isn't a DOD cert you're getting. It's not a pro boards kind of thing, right? So we thought we were going to get a little kickback, and surprisingly, the support of the leadership all the way up has been super supportive, and it was pretty smooth sailing. And then we expanded it. We allow people from all over the DOD, firefighters from all over the DOD. So we've had active duty, civilian, Navy, civilian side, and then obviously reserves. It's open to the Guard and all that. So, and sister service. So that's kind of like why we came up with it. And and I think it's important to note too that we didn't come up with anything new. Like I said, these were all things that were delivered to us. Chris and I acted as facilitators or collaborators, I should say. We got in touch with a lot of instructors throughout our command that had a ton of passion and talent, and expertise in this subject. And it just made sense to pull our resources together. We had a couple guys from Hawaii that were down there a week before, and they built all the props we needed and everything. And it was meant to be kind of thing. And it just kind of came together like that. And it just so happened it coincided with the DoD coming out with a RIT CBT. And, which is a great CBT. It gives you the working knowledge and the cognitive functions of RIT operations. But I think we all can agree that, to really learn these skills, you got to get hands on it. Right. And so that's where, we hope to come in and facilitate that.
Yeah, some of that stuff is the most important. It is the most important. Get that hands-on training. You don't necessarily have to walk away with a certification.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
I'll print you out a cert if that's what you want.
Exactly.
But,
yeah.
This is where the rubber meets the road. This is the stuff that really matters.
Yeah.
And it sounds like something that could eventually end up as curriculum, maybe in the DoD Academy at some point. Depending on how far you guys take this, because
that'd be nice.
Yeah, it sounds great. And did you guys collaborate at all with the people that developed that CBT that's on Total Force Virtual Learning Center? I think it was guys up at Fairchild that developed that.
Yeah, it would have been, I can't remember what year, but we went with that group from Fairchild to Niagara to start to put together an Air Force-wide RIT lesson plan. And our course is separate from that. A lot of the same skills and drills are, taught in both courses. But I haven't heard, I guess any kind of follow-up, with where they're at on, being able to bring something to the total force. But we certainly see a need for it. I think the other piece to that puzzle is, I think the fire service as a whole is light years behind law enforcement and certainly combat-specific AFSCs and MOSs in teaching our guys what to expect, when the fight or flight response kicks in. And just to understand that when that happens, you're not thinking with your rational brain the way we're thinking right now, having this conversation on this podcast.
Yeah, Chris, let's get into that a little bit. So that would definitely tie into a why the course was created, because the best way to prepare for those fight or flight scenarios is to do it, right? Or to practice it. Just like you mentioned earlier, we can't simulate somebody falling through the floor, but we can do our best job to try to simulate that. So I don't know, can you talk on it a little bit, understanding kind of the fight or flight, the human psychology or the human physiology behind it, and how you tie it into the course? Yeah,
so during the course, we talk a lot about the amygdala hijack. And that's kind of what I was making a reference to, where, when your life flashes before your eyes, or whatever happens in that moment that you think you might not come out of that situation, whatever it might be, we're not thinking with our rational brains, right? Our emotional brains take over and we instinctively react. And so an example of that might be, running out of air. I would bet most people listening to this podcast, sitting in a training room at 70 degrees, could recite perfectly what they would do if they were to run out of air, right? They'd say, I'd drop to the ground, I'd call a Mayday, I'd try to do my emergency procedure. That didn't work. I'd filter breathe and try to self-extricate or shelter in place, right? Textbook. Mm-hmm. But that's likely very different from how they would react if that happened for real. Because what they're combating is a deeply evolutionary reaction, right? I mentioned I've got a newborn daughter, and as demented as this example might be, if something were to cover her face, she doesn't have to be taught to try to pull away from it, right? She knows that instinctively. And that's what we're trying to combat here. And there's a pretty incredible phenomenon with firefighters and with scuba divers being found with, in this example, with their face pieces ripped off, but with air remaining in their cylinder. And that's exactly why. We have to follow up the cognitive training with the the hands-on training, and it's got to be repetitive, and it's got to be under stress to begin to hope that we're going to react appropriately if we're in that situation for real.
Yeah, a bunch of great points. So when developing this course, when developing the curriculum, were you studying any line of duty deaths within the fire service, within the American Fire Service? You mentioned people having masks on and taking them off with air still in their cylinder. Is a lot of what you teach based around that?
Yeah, so actually every single skill and drill is tied to a NIOSH report throughout the entire course. And that kind of, provides the why and helps get, buy-in from the students as to why we're doing what we're doing. But we found in building the course that, literally no NIOSH report says that, everything was going perfect until this one catastrophic thing happened, right? Every single one has contributing factors being little things that added up to lead to the big thing being the line of duty death. And so a lot of the course is built around, identifying what those factors are. In the course, we call them slack. So we've got a no slack standard throughout the whole course. And I mentioned to you, we've got our sins of slack. But throughout the course, there's all these little things that are repeatedly cited in NIOSH reports as contributing to line of duty deaths that a lot of times we're in full control of. And that's a big point throughout FRAS that we try to, impress upon the students, that we need to control everything that we can control. So any instance of slack that we can control, we should, because it may be what makes the difference for ourselves or for somebody else.
I'll get into the slack here in a second, but it sounds like you guys are probably well read on Gordon Graham and his high risk, low frequency stuff. I've heard him talk quite a few times, and I've mentioned him on episodes before because I went to a seminar last year in August, so about a year ago now, and he talked very extensively on focusing on root causes of problems and not so much the surface level or what you see in a NIOSH report or a line of duty. There was a root cause for why something went down. It sounds like you guys are getting after that a little bit, getting to where the rubber meets the road, where the firefighter's in the ideal H and how he responds in that situation.
Right. We're trying to stand up as many dominoes as we can in the domino effect, right? And, Gordy Graham, that's kind of what we're talking about with the Johari's window, with the, high risk, low frequency. The other important aspect of that is to not ignore the other panes of that window, right? So we have to first work on our fundamentals. That's the low risk, low frequency. The stuff we don't do a lot, but doesn't have a lot of risk involved. You still got to be good at that stuff. The high risk, high frequency, we do it all the time. So, but you still got to train on it and you got to improve your abilities. That's, the fundamentals of our job. You got to work on those before you can move into the high risk. And, we could sit here and we try really hard not to operate in the world of theory. That's why it was super important to us to, accompany the drills with NIOSH reports, to have experienced instructors that we have instructors in our cadre that have actually been involved in Mayday incidents and bringing their expertise. And, the best instructors have experience, knowledge, and the training, right? And if you want to be an instructor, you have to, spend the 95% of your time being a student, right? And then collaborating and pushing out the material, right? And so that was really important to us to make sure that we don't operate in that world of theory, that it's actually practical, sound techniques and tactics that we're teaching, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And I thinking a lot about slack after you had mentioned that. Slack sounds to me like what you'd mentioned, Travis. Chris, you mentioned slack, but Travis, you'd mentioned doing those fundamental things and practicing those fundamental things. Slack sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, like those small details, putting your gear on or bringing in the right equipment or making one smooth pass to the seat of the fire, or those little tiny details that end up making the difference. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And I mentioned, we've got a list of sins of slack, right? Throughout the course, they're paid for by 10 push-ups after whatever the skill or drill. Both the student and the instructor pay for them, just in an attempt to reinforce, the why, right? Behind why disconnecting your regulator with air remaining in an IDLH is a sin of slack. Because there are dozens of NIOSH reports where that's occurred, where a stressful event has happened and the firefighters ripped their mask off or disconnected their regulator with good air on their back.
Go ahead.
Another sin of slack that we talk about is giving the wrong location on a Mayday. Right? That's a contributing factor in tons of NIOSH reports. And so, if throughout FRAS a student, gives their Mayday and says they're on floor 3, but they're really on 2, and now command's sending every resource they have to 3, that could be it. Just that one instance of slack is what could have made the difference.
And so you guys have developed scenarios to intentionally put people into these circumstances to where you know how they're going to react, and you're trying to kind of beat it out of them, for lack of a better term. Hopefully they react the right way, but that some people won't, and so you beat those bad habits out of
Exactly. Yeah.
people.
So, there was a buzzword in the fire service in training called stress inoculation for a number of years, and I don't know. In my experience, I've learned that, or I've seen that buzzword kind of get manipulated or twisted to give certain instructors a free pass and just being a jerk, right? And kind of beat their chest or be ego driven, right? And that's the
Right.
opposite of what we're trying to do here. Stress inoculation is I don't want to say slowly or even gradually, but introducing stress at a controlled rate to
Right. And making it realistic
exactly,
too,
and
right?
increasing the student's threshold to be able to manage more as the week goes on or as scenarios advance.
Gotcha. Okay. And so when you say progressive, that's what you mean by
Exactly.
progressive. You're progressively introducing them into more
and so
stress.
kind of going back to
Or-
the how we handle our instructors. I feel like this is another aspect that makes our class unique. Is we have a very robust instructor OJT program. Like Chris mentioned, all the instructors have met all the standards that we have set forth, and Chris could talk about like the standards more if you want, but we have a very robust instructor OJT, so we make sure that the instructors are on the same page about how we're introducing stress, right? And there was a buzzword that went through the corporate world back in like the late 80s, early 90s called a flow state. And what that means is basically you're performing a skill or you're performing a task perfectly matching your ability, and you can perform it without thinking, right? So a good example would be for a firefighter calling a Mayday, right? Throughout the week, at the beginning of the week, some of our students have maybe never practiced calling Maydays. So just that one skill in itself may cause anxiety in the student. And if a skill is, if you picture a kind of a graph, if a skill is, or a task requires so much skill above what the student is capable of handling, their ability, it introduces in a realm of anxiety. That's where they're operating. If it's too simple for them, their skill is too high, then they're bored, right? So you want to meet that perfect match, and that's your flow state, where you're performing without even thinking about it. It perfectly matches your ability. So going back to the Mayday scenario or example, the student calling a Mayday at the beginning of the week, they're going to be anxiety ridden, just keying up the mic and giving their location, going through their acronym, whatever that is that they decide to use, and remembering where they are. That's a lot to manage. But throughout the week, every situation has met Mayday criteria. So by the end of the week, they have to call. They can't be anxiety ridden by calling the Mayday. They got to do that without thinking, because they have so much more to manage in the scenarios. So that's kind of what we mean by the stress inoculation, and using flow state to keep students engaged and increasing that threshold of what they're able to handle.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. That was exactly what I was going to say to follow up with that. You're increasing the threshold of what they're able to handle so that their flow state is a stressful situation.
Exactly.
As you were talking about the Mayday scenario, I thought about a NIOS report that I read. I think it was the fire in '88 in New York. It was a car dealership. There were tires in the attic space. You guys maybe it was New Jersey.
Hackensack.
Anyways,
Yeah.
Hackensack fire. The IC wasn't acknowledging the Mayday call. Is there any integration with command element or someone outside of the Ideal H, the communication piece of it? Because it sounds like the IC is at fault in some of these reports.
So the students are issued radios at the beginning of the week. So all communication is actually done, on their radio to establish that muscle memory and to get used to listening back, right, for communication from command. So there'll be an instructor running command for every scenario, and a lot of the kind of the non-scenario drills, just because that's an important piece of the puzzle that I think we neglect a lot of times in fire training, is listening to your radio, being able to effectively communicate, with command on your radio and be able to coordinate together in that sense to do whatever needs done.
So the students are communicating with the instructors who act as the command. I don't know, from your guys' perspective, in just reading some of these studies and 15 years in service, you think that incident commanders should have some semblance of training with this kind of stuff too?
Absolutely.
Yeah, we've actually had some discussions about that. So Fire Department Training Network does a really good commanding the RIT class. I've never taken it. I've just heard really good things from people who have. I highly recommend checking that out if you get the chance. But we've talked about. I'm definitely not going to sit here and say that I'm an expert in IC operations, especially for a RIT. But we've had the command chief of Duke Air Reserve Station, I think is what it's called, down outside of Eglin. He's a command chief master sergeant, but he kind of came up through the pipeline through Air Force firefighting, and he's a civilian job. He's a battalion chief for Dothan, Alabama, and he came out and did a really good presentation on commanding an actual Mayday event, and he's kind of talked about that too. Like, I think having people like that to incorporate an IC aspect would be, I mean, if we're talking, aspirations, that would be definitely one of them, So we call this class Air Force or Firefighter Rescue and Survival. Technically, it's level one. We kind of pictured it like a rescue school, what rescue school used to be kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, it could be tiered.
So we kind of left it open for that. And then big aspirations, we could maybe in the future do something like that. But
we've certainly built a good foundation, it sounds like. But yeah, it sounds like a great idea. It's something that I would certainly love to participate in. I fill the role as an assistant chief now, and I wouldn't feel comfortable in that kind of circumstance.
Many people who would.
Never. No, I mean, I understand that they're few and far between, really. And that's why there's classes like what you guys designed to try to get after that. Talking a little bit about the standards you mentioned earlier for instructors, what are the standards? What does it take to be an instructor or something like this?
Yeah. So I mentioned we've got something called the no slack standard. And it's essentially a go, no go standard for every single skill or drill. And so everybody that meets the no slack standard for each objective throughout the course gets the no slack patch when they graduate, and then that's the pool of firefighters that we'll pull for our instructor OJT program. So that's something that's really important to us. Again, that every instructor can meet every single standard that they're teaching, and something that's a little atypical about the course is that everything gets demoed by an instructor in full gear and SCBA before a student does anything, and almost every scenario has a live victim, which is an instructor besides our live fire scenarios. And that, one provides the realism of how an actual body will actually move. And then it also gives our instructors a pretty intimate view about how the objective went.
Well, your instructors have credibility as instructors. Hey, watch me do it. Like,
exactly.
Okay, now you go do it. Well, this guy actually does know what he's talking about. He's not standing up in the podium and talking about everything that he knows. And so the instructors are required to go through, if I'm understanding this right, they're required to go through the course before they can actually be instructors or even be in the pool of acceptable instructors.
Yeah, so that's part of our instructor OJT. We try to, obviously Chris and I aren't always going to be in the Air Force, and we would like to see this program continue, right? So bringing students who performed well back, who have met the standards, and introducing maybe the first few times there's a build up to it, right? They're probably going to be a victim a lot. They're learning how to instruct, or with the model that we're presenting, I guess. And over time, we're letting them take over entire scenarios, entire evolutions where they're in charge of it, right, as the lead instructor. And, Chris and I have gone back and forth on leading the course, right? So hopefully in the future, we can pass that on to other instructors and they can take it and run with it. And that's kind of the mentorship aspect of it, of bringing instructors back and building the course for future, generations.
Yeah, it sounds like a good system you got built. And just thinking as you're talking, we could almost use the same construct for other Fireground classes. Yeah. We get Whit Dotson out there talking about hose advancements and, hose flowing and nozzles and everything else. It sounds like, and you get out there, you get your hands on and you have to prove yourself before you can teach it. And it's a week long or whatever. It sounds like that would be something good for Air Force fire protection and definitely the DoD. So
yeah, I do want to add too with the no slack standard. A no-go doesn't mean that, a student's removed from the course. So, they still continue on with training. It's not a big deal. It happens frequently. But, standard is the standard at the end of the day. And so we always say if, a student comes in and knocks it out of the park, outstanding. We don't make it harder. But if a student doesn't meet the standard, that doesn't mean that they're a bad fireman. It just means they've got something to work on, which is the whole point. For students and instructors. That's why we're there, to find any little weakness we could possibly have and fix it.
Well, failure is a part of growth. It's important to stumble so that you can learn what to do right. Let's talk a little bit about survival mindset. You guys mentioned that to me. You may have hit on it already. I don't know, but explain what the survival mindset is.
So there's a guy named Lawrence Gonzalez who has a book called Deep Survival, who I highly recommend to anybody in the fire service. And Lawrence believes that there's a very discoverable science behind who lives, who dies, and why. Right? Why a Navy SEAL, dies on a routine kayaking trip with his family, but why a 7-year-old girl can survive a plane crash and live on her own in the jungle for a week before being rescued. And so there are a couple principles in his book that permeate through FRAS, and one of them is understanding the mental models that we've each developed through recognition prime decision making. And what that is bookmarks that we have in our brain that manifest themselves through a gut feeling that you see a situation and instantly what needs done. So that, just for example, compared to classical decision making, which is how a computer works. So, if a computer needs a Halligan bar, it's going to go find the apparatus, open the first compartment, look at the first tool and say, is this a Halligan bar? No, it's a gated Y. Looks at the next tool. Is this a Halligan bar? No, it's a hydrant wrench. And it's going to work its way around systematically, eventually coming to a Halligan bar. The way recognition prime decision making works is you know what a Halligan bar is because you were trained on it in the academy. You know where it's at on the rig because you checked it out that morning. You know how to use it, right? Because you've used it throughout your career on fires. And so you see a door that needs forced and your brain can instantly snap to the irons, right? So It's great, and it's really important because it's efficient, and we need that on the Fireground. But where we can get in trouble is when we apply an inaccurate bookmark to an unfamiliar situation. And I think one of the most common instances of that in the fire service is, at least on my job, 9 times out of 10, we pull the 1 3/4 200-foot pre-connect. I mean, it gets the job done, right? We're pulling enough GPMs to absorb the BTUs and the fire goes out. But we roll up on a real deal commercial fire. I think the most common example of that in the fire service is pulling the 1 3/4 pre-connect, right? 9 times out of 10, our bread and butter residential fires, that's plenty of GPMs to put the BTUs out. And, it's great. But that one time we roll up on a real deal commercial fire. And what do? We step off the rig, we pull the 1 3/4 pre-connect because that's what our mental model says to do. That's what we've done in the past. It's always worked. And so we apply an inaccurate bookmark to an unfamiliar situation. And another part of that might be that we don't have a bookmark at all for a situation. And I think that's something that's pretty common in the Air Force, that sure, we go on plenty of in-flights. We've had break fires, maybe an engine fire, but it's not every day that a heavy falls out of the sky, right? So that's why it's so important to train on it. But we got to recognize that in ourselves, that we likely don't have a bookmark at all for what that situation is going to be like. And that's where we can get in trouble.
And so the course is focused on kind of shaping that survival mindset and creating that recognition, prime decision making, creating that Rolodex of bookmarks. Am I understanding
That's
that
exactly right? And we're in control of the mental models we have to some extent, right? So the important thing is recognizing when a situation's changed and the mental model that we're applying, isn't accurate anymore. We can train and recognize that in ourselves. But through training, we can develop these bookmarks, right? By seeking outside live fire training or whatever it might be, we can develop them in ourselves. That's something that we're in full control of. And something else we
Gotcha.
talk a lot about is, I mentioned FLAC earlier. Lawrence in Deep Survival talks about the normalization of deviance.
I love that.
Which is the gradual process by which unacceptable behavior becomes acceptable.
Each one of us does it too, every single day.
That normalization of deviance starts with the rationalization, right? That maybe a shortcut saves time. So an example of that might be putting your seatbelt on. Right, the run's right around the corner. I don't need to put my seatbelt on, or maybe checking out your pack in the morning. B shift didn't have a fire. Oh no, my pack's good. I'm not going to check it out. Maybe another.
Or you didn't have a fire last shift, and I was good last shift, so I'm going to be good this shift.
Exactly. Or what about peer pressure or pride?
Yep.
Those can be part of the rationalization too. That maybe you're part of a truck company that always goes to the roof. Right, it's a point of pride for your crew, and so now you roll up on something that fire's blowing out. It's self-vented. It doesn't need another hole, but you go to the roof anyways because it's a point of pride. And so that unacceptable behavior gets repeated, and if there's no consequence, it's reinforced.
Right,
and it might be with ourselves personally as individual firefighters. It might be on your crew, or it might be a fire department-wide infestation. I think a prime example in the American Fire Service is obesity. Right? You can spend 20 years on this job and rationalize it with, if the stuff really hits the fan, my adrenaline's going to be pumping and I'll be able to pony up to do what needs done.
Right.
Or your physical ability is not going to be enough.
Yeah, another good example, in my opinion, is the use of respiratory protection or just protective clothing the right way, and with the byproducts of combustion that are inside and outside of structure fires, and kind of how we deal with that, how we wash our gear, or the fact that we don't wash our gear. I know the science is developing on that stuff, but another good example, I think.
That's a perfect instance of slack. And we want to change that mentality for wearing your mask. The slack is taking your mask off early. That's not salty to me. To be the one in there breathing smoke. It's harder to keep your mask on. That's why people want to rip it off. That's why people want to take their pack off. It's not salty to be the one in there without your gear on. So those are all little instances of slack that we're in full control of, that contribute to, it could be a line of duty death, or in this example, it could be cancer, right?
Sure. And so tying that back into the course, again, you guys are developing the curriculum, developing these practical training evolutions to eliminate that slack and to create those markers, those recognition markers, and to eliminate that normalization of deviance in regards to fireground survival.
Yeah, that's why no slack is our motto. It's on the patch, that you get at the end of the week for meeting the standards. But it's kind of become a catchphrase within the instructor cadre. We've whenever there's an instance where we come together and we're planning the next drill or we're putting together the next drill, and there's a couple times where maybe somebody will be like, we don't need that extra 50-foot line, right? Or or we don't need this on it, or we don't need that, or whatever, and we'll just kind of look at each other and be like, no slack, got to do it. So it keeps us on course. I think it keeps the students on course of the buy-in there and pressing forward with that. So
you created a culture
exactly
of no mediocrity.
That's the idea.
Yeah, and when you're talking about fireground survival, or you're talking about rescuing people from a burning home, I don't think there should be any room for mediocrity, right?
That no slack mentality is a nod to Lieutenant Colonel Dave Hackworth. If anybody's
familiar with him, yep, definitely.
He wrote a book called Steal My Soldiers' Hearts, in which he talks about taking command of the 39th Infantry Regiment of the 4th Battalion during one of his tours in Vietnam. And he talked about the 439th having a horrible reputation. Morale was at an incredible low. He talks about a 6-month period where they suffered some 40% casualties, predominantly from friendly fire and from booby traps. And Colonel Hackworth realized that it was the little things that were getting his guys killed. Mm-hmm. They weren't wearing camouflage out on missions, or they weren't wearing their helmets on the fire support base. They weren't taking care of their feet or maintaining their weapons. And so in his book, he talks about one of the first things he did was reinstitute the tradition of saluting, in which he would require an enlisted man, when they reported to an officer, to salute and say, "Hardcore recondo, sir," to which the officer would reply with, "No effing slack." And the same thing is true in the fire service.
If I was a betting man, I'd say you're probably a 𝗧𝗿𝗃𝗀𝗃𝗀 fan.
Big time. Yep.
Yeah. He talks about Hackworth all the time, and he talks about no effing slack all the time. And I think he kind of built their training regimen. He was a West Coast trainer of SEALs at one point in his career, and I think he built all of that training around Hackworth, But talking a little bit on combat, there's a book called On Combat, right?
On Combat, yeah.
On Combat. Talk about that a little bit, Chris. I think you're the one that mentioned it to me, and how that, what that book talks about and how you tie that into the course.
Yeah, that's by Lieutenant Colonel Grossman. He's one of the leading experts out there on predominantly training law enforcement on what to expect in police action shootings. But there are tons of parallels to our job. In the book, he talks about different conditions that are associated with your heart rate. And he talks about condition red is typically when your heart rate is between 115 beats per minute and 145 beats per minute, and how that is optimal for survival, right? That your heart's pumping, your blood's flowing, you're primed and ready to act. But once we start to creep up to that 175 beats per minute mark, we creep into condition black, which is not good for survival. That's where we experience different sensory distortions, so tunnel vision or auditory exclusion or loss of memory, which all that can occur in training too. And we see it frequently when students are debriefing, trying to piece together, did we search 2 rooms or 3 rooms? And it's because their heart rate's elevated. That can be due to physical exertion or stress, and they're starting to creep into that condition black. And to me, that speaks volumes about how important physical conditioning is. Because if just the tone's going off, running to the truck, putting your gear on, you're up at 145 beats per minute. And now stretching a line and masking up and forcing the front door, you could easily be creeping into that 175 beats per minute range into condition black, where you lose fine motor control. That's where that fight or flight response starts to become an issue, where it works negatively against us. So we talk about that a fair amount through the course, the research he's done on those different conditions.
I guess the first step is understanding that happens to you. I think that all of us know that our heart rates elevate, especially if there's a serious call and you know that it's a serious call. But maybe understanding deeper of how you react physiologically to that is going to help you. But I think there's nothing more important than practicing.
Yeah, and that's something we know, right? That the stress of a catastrophic situation will impact you less if you prepared for it, even mentally. If you put yourself in that mind state mentally in training, it can start to make the way you would feel real world charted territory, if even just a little bit.
Gents, I was going to move into the last thing. Is there anything else?
The big thing I want to add with, we talked about keeping students in the flow state. The only thing I really want to add there is give the recognition where recognition is due. So Dr. Judy Glicksmith is a psychologist that took another psychologist's work about being in a flow state that got popular in the business world. And she brought it into the fire service. That was research done by a guy named 𝗘𝗽𝗃 𝗕𝗽𝗃, and she took his work and applied it to the fire service. She has a great book called Flow-Based Leadership, where she applies it to how leaders in the fire service operate in a flow state. So I highly recommend her work and her book, and recommend having her on your podcast. Actually, should be good.
Oh, that would be legit. Yeah. How about you, Chris? You have anything?
I'll add with, Travis talking about keeping the students in a flow state. Another thing that's maybe a little different about this course than your normal fire department course is that we built in room for gray area. Like I said, there's a firm standard, but we care that you meet the standard, right? I think a challenge that Air Force firefighting has is sometimes firefighting can seem very black and white. Right, we've got our AFIs, we like our checklists, and that's all important, for continuity's sake. I heard either Chief Morris or Chief Wagner say recently that there are some 11,000 firefighters total force across all of our installations. So that stuff's all very important, but it can make firefighting seem black and white, and it's not. There's lots of gray area, and that's the place for decision making. An example of that would probably be highly controversial with podcast listeners is coming off the rig masked up. I'm sure there are plenty of installations where you come off masked up with a report of a working fire or you're wrong. And then there'll be plenty that think you should never mask up in the rig. And that gray area is, if you've had the conversation with your crew chief that if we have a report of entrapment, the back step is going to mask up. We'll be off comms for that second, and then we're going to beeline to do whatever needs done, then maybe it's a good decision. If you mask up and now you've got to go to the roof, or, it's cold out and you've got a yard lay, and so now your mask is all fogged up and you can't see, and either you've got to stop and take your mask off, or do something that we certainly don't recommend is to use your good air by opening your bypass to clear fog. Well, then it was probably the wrong decision. So that's something we were really intentional about, is leaving room for that gray area. We want students to be in that flow state and do whatever they would do real world. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't work, great, because now you know.
Right. Yeah. So it sounds like you're giving a lot of autonomy to the leader of the crew,
We have
even the individual.
we have a
Do what they think is
graduate
right.
of class 2, I believe it was, Master Sergeant 𝗘𝗵𝗿𝗃𝗀𝗃𝗃, Harry 𝗘𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃. He's a Baltimore firefighter, captain on a rescue, and he was an AC up at Dover, yeah.
Dover.
And he talks about it. He's like, the Air Force kind of tends to create a monster a little bit of, there's, like Chris said, it's black and white. We're tied to our checklists and things like that, and that's all well and good, but there's you gotta create decision making in firefighters. That is a critical skill for a firefighter, is being able to critically think critically. So we're hoping to kind of kill that monster, right?
Yeah, and you guys are definitely a part of killing that monster. Not to defend the Air Force, but a big variable is that we're just so young
Sure.
and inexperienced, and so what do you do to make up for that aside from train? Well, let's build a checklist so that we know what to do in this circumstance,
It
and
makes sense, but-
And so and so nothing against the people that create the checklists, and certainly nothing against the people that want to train to kind of to inoculate themselves to those stressful circumstances. But it's just a variable within Air Force fire protection that we have, and we have to kind of contend with. And like Travis said, you just got to recognize that it's there. Yeah, guys, let's connect statistics a little bit to fireground survival, rapid intervention, whatever you got, and talk about what Air Force firefighters can do right now.
So we pulled
stuff.
a lot of our statistics. Obviously, like we said, we've been saying this whole time, NIOSH reports are attached to every drill, every scenario. But we've pulled statistics from Project Mayday or projectmayday.net. I recommend going on there. They have a robust list of every stat you'd want to know about any Mayday incident that occurred between 2015 and 2019. What they found in gathering their data was 35% of the time a Mayday is called, the firefighter who called the Mayday self-extricates and solves his own problem, his or her own problem. Then another 26% of the time, the problem was solved by the victim's crew, and then 25% by an adjacent crew working in their area within a search crew or whatever, if they're on the line. And only about 6% of Maydays are rectified by an actual RIT team or a RIT crew. So we've kind of implement those statistics to build, we spend a lot of time with fireground survival. Solve your own problem first. Never quit, which is a set of slack. Don't quit on yourself. And then we create drills where you may be on a hand line and there's a Mayday. What do you do? Well, if you're on the nozzle, you don't want to leave it, right? So you still have to continue fighting the fire. But what if your officer, 3 corners back is like, oh, did he say he's on the Bravo side? That's right around the corner. Maybe I can solve the problem for him, right? So there's that decision making, right? That gray area that we leave up to them. You still have to call the Mayday and things like that, but that's a lot of the idea behind some of the drills. And then obviously we spend a lot of time on RIC operations, RIC tactics, and how to formulate a RIC crew and what the roles and responsibilities are for each person. So that's kind of how the statistics tie into our drills. But really what the statistics say is that we got to be ready for anything and everything, right? And it gets down to, being prepared for whatever going back to the Johari's window, working on your fundamentals, right? There's a great quote by Battalion Chief of Atlanta by Chief David Rhodes, and he's wrote a ton of articles for fire engineering and whatnot. But one of the biggest things I've taken away from him is he talks about how when a civilian calls 911, they don't get to call 911 and say, hey, my house is on fire, my baby's trapped on the second floor window or bedroom, and I want you to send me engine 8 because those guys know what they're doing and they're trained really hard and they don't have slack in their organization, right? You know, they don't get to do that. Who do they get? They get who they get, right? And for us as firefighters, if we go down in a fire and we call a Mayday, it's the same thing. I don't get to get on and say, Mayday, 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 this is Firefighter Bender. I'm on the second floor. Don't send me the RIT crew you have. Send me ladder 7 because those guys really know RIT, right? Like, I get who I get. So, and my expectation is whoever's coming in after me knows what they're doing and has trained on it and has worked at perfecting and mastering their craft, right? So how dare we show up and be anything less than that expectation for the civilians and for any firefighters, any one of our brothers or sisters that goes down, right? Another buzzword in the fire service is how it's a brotherhood or sisterhood or whatever. And, you know, a lot of people use that as an excuse to say, oh, you know, hey, come help me move, or, you know, I'm running a little bit late. Can you stay over for me or whatever? That's part of it. But the other part of it is you as an individual have to prove that you're a brother or a sister, that you are a reliable team member. And, you know, that just goes down to doing the little things, getting back to the basics. You know, if I know you had Whit, we talked about Whit Dotson on the podcast, you were on your podcast. And, you know, if you're on a pump panel and on a fire, you can't afford to be anything less than Whit Dotson, right? You got to nerd out on that and provide the GPM necessary to put out the fire. And as well, if you're on the nozzle, you got to be able to deliver that GPM on target and quickly and efficiently, right? So that's kind of the things you can do right now is don't ignore those fundamentals of our job and call it preventing the RIC, right? Let's put the fire out so we don't have to bail out of the window to begin with, right? And I know that with anybody listening to your podcast, you know, they're taking time out of their day to listen to, you know, a couple firemen talk about fireman stuff, right? Which is awesome. But I'm also kind of preaching to the choir, right? The hard part now is taking that and spreading it to others, building others up around you. And, you know, one of the things that Chris says all the time that I really like is that at FRAS, we're not just trying to make good firefighters better. We're trying to build an army of firefighters that says the minimum standard ain't going to cut it.
Yeah, awesome stuff, Travis, and great advice. Chris, anything to add on that?
You know, that no slack mentality, like we've said over and over, is something each of us is in full control of, right? And that's something any firefighter can do the very next shift they work. Check out your air pack all the way. Put your seatbelt on. You can commit to training every single shift, no matter how many runs you take, something hands-on with your crew, every shift, no matter what. You can work out every single shift. You know, all of that plays into eliminating slack within yourself and within your organization and to ultimately be prepared. And I like to talk about my worst fear on this job is to be put in a situation where a brother or sister firefighter or civilian is counting on me and I'm not able to get the job done as a result of being unprepared. Maybe we're assigned to a RIT that gets activated and we get to the down firefighter and we just don't know what to do. We weren't paying attention during our RIT training and we have no idea how we're going to package this individual and get them up the stairs. Or maybe I can't conserve my air. Maybe I didn't check out my pack that morning and I started the shift at 3,800 PSI instead of 4,500 PSI. And now those couple minutes are critical and we've got to call in the secondary RIT to try to get the job done. Because I feel like when that happens, you have to convince yourself in your mind that everything that could have been done was done, but know deep down in your heart that you weren't ready for it. And that's one of the brutal realities of this profession, that anybody that's done this job for real for any significant amount of time will tell you there's been multiple times throughout their career that their knowledge or their physical ability, their training or their experience, all of that adds up to your work capacity as a firefighter. Those 4 things: your knowledge, your physical ability, your training, and your experience. And there will be times throughout your career that your work capacity as a firefighter equals somebody's life expectancy. And that's what this course is all about for students and for instructors. It's part of the career-long journey of being ready for whatever needs done, no matter what it might be.
Yeah, again, great advice, great points. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. For those listeners out there that want to participate in the class, how often is it happening? How do they get involved, or how do they sign up?
Once a year. So Class 4 is scheduled for the 1st through the 5th of March, 2021. It's at Dobbins ARB Reserve Base, their Expeditionary Combat Support Training Certification Center. It's their ECSTCC.
And how many students can get in each class? 12.
Yep,
Okay.
and it's open to all DoD firefighters. So like Travis mentioned, we've had active duty, Guard, Reserve, civilians, Army, Navy, Marines, open to anybody. We do have a Facebook group out there, AFRC, Firefighter, Rescue, and Survival. It's open to any DoD firefighter, and we use it as kind of an open forum. So we'll discuss some tactics and techniques on there. And then it's also a good place for students that are training for the course to interact with students that have been through the course to get tips on how to prepare for it.
Yeah, I think a good idea would have videos on there that can, little drills that you can replicate. You guys do stuff like that. I'm a part of the group, but I haven't.
Yeah, that's kind of what we use it for. Post videos and articles and things like that relating to, fireground survival and rescue, and talk about them. So
we'll post the as soon as the registration for Class 4 opens, we'll post it in there. Travis is the NCOIC for the course, so he's got a email list for anybody that wants to be on it. As soon as the class posts, he'll forward it out. His email is travis.bender, BENDER, at us.af.mil. And, that should trickle down through the chain. We realize, that's not always, the most efficient. So regardless if you're an airman basic or a chief, if you're interested in this course, shoot him an email. He'll add you to the mailing list, and you'll be notified as soon as registration comes out. That way you can try to also push it up your chain of command to get one of the 12 spots.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for sharing all of this stuff, motivating. And, I know a lot of our listeners are going to enjoy it, and you'll probably have a lot of people wanting to sign up for the class, hopefully. So
I hope.
Or replicate, some of what you do in the class, one of the two. And so I appreciate your time, gents.
All right. Thank you.
Matt, thanks for having us on, man. We know what it's like to have a labor of love, like I'm sure this podcast is for you and Ben, and man, you guys are spreading the good word, so keep it up.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Firedog Podcast. You can find more content just like this regularly posted to our Facebook page at facebook.com/the Firedog Podcast, and on our Instagram page at the Firedog Podcast. That is the Fire DAWG Podcast. Please don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen. And if you like what you've heard so far, we humbly ask for your 5-star review and feedback on Apple Podcasts. We want to share this content with as many Department of Defense firefighters as possible, and the best way for us to get after that and to expand our reach is with your rating and feedback on Apple Podcasts. Conversely, if we can improve in some way, we want to know. Reach out to us at thefiredogpodcast@gmail.com and let us know what we can do better. Lastly, please don't forget to share this podcast with your friends and coworkers on social media or at the firehouse. This is host Matt Wilson with guests Travis Bender and Chris Boykley. Until next time, stay safe.